All right, we'll have people joining us, but let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I know a lot of you attended our February forum on accessible playgrounds, and we're really glad to see you back with us today. Today, our forum is pedestrian trails and shared use paths. And once again, we are so thrilled to have Bill Botten as our accessibility consultant here today to provide information during this forum. Bill is retired, although he failed at retirement because I think he's working equally hard as he did in his previous jobs, but he's retired technically from the U.S. Access Board, where he was for 22 years as an accessibility specialist, a technical assistance coordinator, and the training coordinator for the federal agency that develops the accessibility standards under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act. We're really happy to have Bill here today for the second forum. And I'd just remind you all that we will be having two more forums and we haven't chosen the topics yet. We're looking for your feedback. We got some after the last forum. So we're just trying to see where people land on topics of interest because Bill he can do anything you ask. I'm sure of it. He's an expert on everything. It's mind blowing. Joe's going to be sending out a survey. So be sure that on that survey, if there's a topic that's of burning interest to you, let us know what it is and we'll accommodate the bigger requests, what rises to the top during our third and fourth quarter forums, which haven't been set yet, but we plan to do them after your busy summer season, so at the end of the third quarter. For today, if you have questions, just put them in the group chat as we go, and I'll break Bill at appropriate times and read him the questions so that we can address them as they're relevant to the topics that we're discussing in our pedestrian trails and shared use paths information today. So with that, let's welcome Bill Botten.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Joe. And I thank everyone else for joining us today. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that my internet is strong and continues to run throughout this presentation. We've had a lot of wind that's going on here I'm in suburban Maryland. And so I'm hoping that doesn't affect this opportunity to present this information. As Renee said, I used to work for the federal government and retired a couple of years ago and really worked on a lot of the requirements for pedestrian trails and shared use paths, but also the technical assistance materials that I'll highlight at the end of the presentation. And so I'm going to go through some of the scoping and technical requirements of both of these, try to give you a better understanding of the differences and hopefully a better understanding throughout this that you have an idea of the type of facility you're constructing or altering so that you have an idea of the minimum requirements that you should be applying to that project. I can't tell you how many times I get a question about a trail and it's not actually a trail, it's an accessible route. It's connecting elements and spaces on a site. And if you are connecting elements and spaces, say you have Happy Trail that circles the pond and connects to a fishing pier, a bathroom, and who knows, maybe a sports field. That is not a trail. You can call it Happy Trails, but it is not a trail. Under the guidelines and standards, it would be what we call an accessible route. And the accessible route requirements are a lot more stringent than the requirements that we're going to talk to you about today. Remember, the accessible route requirements really require you to have a running grade no greater than 5%, or else you're creating handrails and edge protection for that route. And that can be really difficult, right, in a recreation setting to do a lot of handrails. So today we're going to talk really about what we call pedestrian access routes, the sidewalk a little bit, is because that's where this rulemaking comes from for shared use paths. But we're going to talk about shared use paths and pedestrian trails. Some of the key elements for the design intent can help you better understand and maybe help you identify the type of facility you're creating. So that accessible route, again, connects elements and spaces in a building or a facility or on a site. The pedestrian access route is designed for pedestrians, typically not bicyclists. A lot of times we have motorized scooters now, electric, all kinds of stuff right on sidewalks, but they're really intended for pedestrians. An accessible, continuous, unobstructed path of travel for use by pedestrians with disabilities and without disabilities to provide that pedestrian circulation path. And that includes the sidewalk, the curb ramps, crosswalks, pedestrian over and underpasses. And then we move on to the pedestrian trail that that third row down, and it's designed for a recreational experience. It doesn't connect elements and spaces on a site. It is just that. It is a route for recreation. Generally includes a trailhead, has very limited transportation function. Okay. So key element here, recreational experience. Um, the shared use path designed primarily for use by bicycles, pedestrians, or other authorized motorized or non-motorized users, right? And a lot of times they are for transportation purposes. They are to get to point A to point B, but they could also be used for recreation. I think a lot of people desire a shared use path near their home so that they can walk that scenic route or enjoy it with, all ages, all abilities. Typically, they're paved, a lot of times asphalt. We'll get into the minimum requirements that came out last year for this. So we are going to talk about a number of different laws. And let me just say right at the very beginning that neither shared use paths or pedestrian trails are currently part of the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. They are not. Those facility types are not included currently in the 2010 ADA standards. Okay, so they're not part of the ADA. But what I want to remind you is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law, right? And it contains this construction standard. But the overriding principle of the Americans with Disabilities Act is that programs, services, and facilities are accessible to, and most importantly, usable by people with disabilities. So if you're designing or constructing a shared use path or a pedestrian trail and your state, city, local government facility, there is not a specific requirement in the ADA that says you have to do this. There's an overriding obligation that your programs be accessible. So what is my safe harbor, right? The safe harbor is to make sure that you meet these minimums to the best of your ability. And we're going to talk about ways you get out of meeting these minimum requirements based on terrain or based on other issues that may be involved. Understand, though, that you do have an obligation in all new construction and alteration of shared use paths and pedestrian trails to do the best you can to make sure that your facilities are usable. And in order to do that, you need to follow these minimum requirements that I'm going to talk to you about. It is your safe harbor. You can always say, and I would think that it would be important for the counties and local governments that are part of this forum today to understand that adopting these as your minimum requirements, whenever someone is in your jurisdiction or in your county creating these special or unique types of facilities. So we're going to talk about that 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, but then we're going to talk about the Architectural Barriers Act. Okay, the Architectural Barriers Act applies to federal lands. It is almost a mirror image of the Americans with Disabilities Act, other than the Outdoor Developed Area Final Rule, which included the pedestrian trails, picnic and camping facilities, viewing areas, beach access routes. It also includes emergency transportable housing that isn't in the Americans with Disabilities Act. But the Architectural Barriers Act, or what we call ABAS, Accessibility Standards, applies to federal lands and can apply to where you receive federal grants or loans. And so it's important to understand where your funding source is for that specific construction project. And if it is federal funding, what is the minimum requirements that they're requiring in order for you to get this funding? So the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines for the public rights of way is where you find the requirements for shared use paths. It was issued by the U.S. Access Board last fall as minimum guidelines that have yet to be adopted by both the standard setting agency for federal government, the General Services Administration, and it has not yet been adopted by the Department of Justice. And so since it is not yet adopted by either one of those standard setting agencies, it's not mandatory currently under Title II, state, city, local government facilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act or Title III. So let me recap. Pedestrian trails currently required for all new construction and alterations on federal lands. It is a best practice for state, city, local government facilities. It should be the minimum requirements that you consider whenever constructing picnic and camping facilities, viewing areas, beach access routes, or pedestrian trails. The ADA and Architectural Barriers Act accessibility guidelines, yet they're guidelines since not yet fully adopted by a standard setting agency, then they would become the standard. So since they're still guidelines, they're non-enforceable. But again, it's still the minimum best practice that you can do when you're constructing shared use paths, because that is where we find the minimum requirements for shared use paths in the public rights of way accessibility guidelines. I've also put on this slide the International Building Code, the IBC. They have been adopting the versions of the Americans with Disabilities Act and including the supplements for the Architectural Barriers Act into the Model Building Code. So based on what your Model Building Code year is, you will start to see some of these requirements into your Model Building Code over time, okay? The process in order to make these from guidelines to standards takes years. The next thing you would see from a standard setting agency, including the Department of Justice, would be what we call a proposed rule. And when they issue a proposed rule on the public right of way, there'll be an opportunity for you to comment. After all that comment period closes, they would analyze that comment and come out with a final rule, which would then be your standard, and it would include implementation dates. I honestly believe that's a long ways off. I don't believe that this administration is going to push forward any more accessibility requirements. And so I would think that it's going to be a decade before we see this incorporated into the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, it is the best practice you can do. There is a minimum to make sure that it is usable by people with disabilities. It is your best defense if there was ever legal action brought against a newly constructed or altered facility that was constructed without any accessibility. So I like to say it's similar to a dog park or a skate park or, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't cover every single type of facility, right? I mean, every day they're coming up with new facilities, different things. And so there's no way for the standard to stay up with that. And that's why that overriding arching obligation that programs, services, and facilities are accessible to, and most importantly, usable by persons with disabilities. So the enforcing agency for the Americans with Disabilities Act is the U.S. Department of Justice. I'll be giving you their contact information at the end of the webinar. It covers state and local government facilities, but also private facilities covered under Title III. It includes that accessible route, that route we talked about earlier that connects elements and spaces on the site. It includes a walking surface, a ramp, maybe a curb ramp. Doors and gates, platform lifts, and even elevators are all considered part of an accessible route. There is requirements for accessible routes that are unique in play areas. They go from 36 inches wide to 60 inches wide. There is a requirement to connect exercise equipment, whether it's inside or outside. Boating and fishing and golf, miniature golf, areas of sport activity like sports fields, swimming pools and spas. Even amusement rides have an accessible route requirement to connect a certain number of them. So you find the requirements on the 2010 ADA standards, and I've given you the website here for the Department of Justice, ada.gov. The Architectural Barriers Act is that federal requirement for your post offices, for federal lands, for federal buildings, things that get federal funding like our schools, our colleges, are required to meet not only the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also the Architectural Barriers Act if they're receiving federal funding. So it's important to look at your federal funding to see what they're specifically requiring you to comply with. If they name the Architectural Barriers Act, there is application for pedestrian trail requirements. Okay, so the Architectural Barriers Act is enforced by the U.S. Access Board. Not only do they write it, but they also enforce it. If you have a complaint against a national park, a federal seashore, Corps of Engineers, any federal land, you can go onto the U.S. Access Board's website and file a complaint even anonymously, and the Access Board has to investigate that complaint. Typically, that starts with a letter. That starts with a letter alleging what the violations are and have they been addressed already? Are they going to be? Are they part of a transition plan? But it's part of a letter. But the Architectural Barriers Act, the opportunity to file a complaint doesn't have to be by the person with the disability, similar to what the Americans with Disabilities Act requires. This could be just a caregiver. It could be a concerned citizen that their post office is not accessible. There's an online complaint form. You fill it out. You can do it anonymously or leave your name, and that way they can get in touch with you and tell you the progress that's being happened with it. This standard is very, very similar, as I told you. There are a few things, okay? Work areas have to be fully accessible for the federal government. A two-story building has to have vertical access in a federal building. Same with state and local. There is that difference with the Architectural Barriers Act that includes that picnic camping, trailheads, pedestrian trails, and also that emergency transportable housing. But other than that, a bathroom is a bathroom, a parking space is a parking space. Everything else, a drinking fountain is a drinking fountain. The two standards are harmonized very closely so that if you have to comply with one, it's very easy to comply with the other. Okay. It also includes accessible routes, recreation facilities, but also that outdoor developed areas that does include pedestrian trails that we're going to talk about today. I told you that the shared use path requirements are in a different law. It's going to be a supplement to the Americans with Disabilities Act and Architectural Barriers Act. So it's a supplement going to be added to the base document, which has to go through a rulemaking process to go from a guideline to a standard. You can see here the enforcing agencies under the ABA, once adopted, typically goes through that agency, but finally ends up at the U.S. Access Board. And the Americans with Disabilities Act adopted again once would be through the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice. So that is the path that the shared use path requirements still need to take, going through that. Okay, going through that process. I've given you the links so that you can get to the actual document itself and look through it. There's not a lot of technical assistance information available about it yet, other than presentations that are on the Access Board's website as well, or the information I'm going to give you today. But there will be resources where you can call if you are constructing one of these unique types of facilities to get their questions answered. But it's most importantly to understand where to find the document so that you can research and look through to see what's said there. So I told you that pedestrian trails are addressed in the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards. They are currently mandatory for all federal lands, new construction and alteration of pedestrian trails. And again, that definition is developed primarily for outdoor recreational purposes, a pedestrian route developed primarily to connect elements or spaces or facilities on a site is not a trail. Okay, it's not a trail if you're connecting elements on a site. Really, really hard to think of in sometimes because I think, like I said, I most often get technical assistance about a trail when it's not actually a trail. It's actually an accessible route where it's connecting elements and spaces on a site. So remember, you can call it happy trails, but the requirements that you want to follow are specific to the facility type it is. The application for pedestrian trail requirements is in all new construction and alterations of existing trails that directly connect to a trailhead or to another trail, pedestrian trail, that substantially complies with these requirements that I'm going to share with you. Okay? There are a bunch of what we call conditional exceptions that are available to use in both new construction and alterations. It became mandatory for the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, and the U.S. Department of Interior, which includes, I think, 7 different federal agencies, including Park Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Fish and Wildlife. I know I'm forgetting at least one. But federal lands, all new construction and alterations after November 25th of 20, 2013. So we're over, what, 12 years now into the requirements for pedestrians, trail requirements on federal land. It's so important if you're state and local government facility, a county facility, that you follow these to the best of your ability, showing you that they were already required over 13 or 12 years ago on federal lands, and that you have to do something. This is your best practice. This is your safe harbor to at least meet the minimums. I already told you, federal agencies, non-federal entities constructed on federal land on behalf of a federal agency. If you have a concessionaire contract, a partnership agreement, or similar arrangement, it could be. Now, facilities not subject to these requirements currently are those subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act under Title II, that's state and local government facilities. It also says that facilities built or altered with federal grants and loans, ABA. So it says not covered because we cannot predict on every opportunity that the funding source specifically calls out for you to comply with anything. Okay, so you need to look at the funding source to see if they say comply with the Architectural Barriers Act when you get funding for the design or construction of a pedestrian trail. If it says comply with the Architectural Barriers Act, there is application. The Architectural Barriers Act is organized similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is that scoping is in Chapter 2, and I'm showing you here where you find the scoping requirements for pedestrian trails in F247. So you'd go to Chapter 2 under the Architectural Barriers Act, and it'd be 247 is where you'd find the scoping requirements. Remember how much of what, when the application occurs. And then your technical chapters, as you can see here, are outlined in Chapter 10. And it just picked up right after we had shooting facilities in 1010, went to 1011. Outdoor constructed features are things like grills, tables, benches, other things like that that you put in a recreation facility. And then you see the technical requirements that we're going to go through are actually in 1017. So conditional exceptions. When we were going through the regulatory negotiation process to determine the minimum requirements for pedestrian trails, there was a real concern that every trail was going to have to be flat, level, paved. Okay, it was a big concern of a lot of outdoor enthusiasts. Understandably so, because that's what you're used to seeing when things are accessible, right? So it gives you a whole bunch of exceptions. When a standard talks about a specific facility type, it says everything must be made accessible unless otherwise stated. This is the otherwise stated. It gives you a lot of these conditional exceptions to say that this portion of my trail cannot comply with that. And so it's provision by provision. And when I say that, it could be the running slope, it could be the cross slope, it could be the tread obstacles, it could be any one of the technical requirements. But when you exempt a trail from one of these conditional exceptions, it's typically not just the whole trail's gone. You still do the best you can in what we say extent practicable. So you do the best you can if you cannot comply. So if the minimum width is 36 inches and you have rock outcroppings that you can't get through, maybe you can get it to 34, 35. You do the best you can. It doesn't mean you don't have to do anything. You're still trying to do the best you can. So there's a lot of limitations, right? And so the first one is it's just not practicable due to the terrain. Maybe you're in a rock field, right? And it's constant rock field. You may not be able to make that firm and stable, right? You may not be able to meet that specific technical ground surface requirement, but you would still try to do the best you could for slope, cross slope, tread obstacles, anything else that you could do, okay? The second one is compliance cannot be accomplished with the prevailing construction practices. Maybe an example of this is the Appalachian Trail. There are certain sections that are only maintained or constructed with volunteers using hand tools. Okay, so if you cannot construct that accessible trail using volunteers and hand tools, there's a requirement that says, or this exception that says, you do the best you can. Okay, you make it as wide as you possibly can. You make it as, smooth as you possibly can. You make it the running slope as gradual as you can, but there's no requirement to bring in automated equipment to try make that accessible. There's a total of 4. Here's the last 2. compliance would fundamentally alter the function or purpose of a facility or setting. So if accessibility is going to alter that facility, I think of maybe an orienteering course, an orienteering course, it's a challenge course or something like that. Maybe it's an ultra marathon trail you're creating. So think about the facility you're creating. If there's issues with that, very subjective, right? Here's what I would say. If you're in the process of designing or constructing or altering an existing pedestrian trail, and you want to use one of these exceptions, I would document it in the project file and make sure that other people understand the reason why we couldn't create the specific requirement, why you couldn't meet the technical requirement for slope, for cross slope, for tread obstacles, or firm and stable surface, that type of thing. The final one is if there's any type of an endangered species, an environmental policy act that's going to be hurt, a historic preservation act that would be, violated, anything like the Wilderness Act would be violated, or any other federal, state, or local law that prohibit the design or construction to be made accessible, there's also an out. Okay? So these are the 4 exceptions why you wouldn't be able to create an accessible pedestrian trail in new construction. And those exceptions, as I've highlighted here in that second to the bottom row, are available to use in all new construction or alterations. So most pedestrian trails are connected by a trailhead, or they have a starting point, right? So it's an outdoor space developed to serve as that access point to the trail. A trailhead is not the junction of 2 trails per this standard. If you decide to put trash cans, picnic tables, water fountains, hydrating station, whatever you decide, a percentage of those are required to be accessible within the trailhead. 20% of each type of outdoor constructed feature provided within the trailhead must be accessible. Okay? Typically, that's going to get you 2 if there's only a couple. It's going to get you both. I'm showing you a really developed trailhead here that is incorporating accessible parking. Remember, even if it's a gravel lot, you still need to determine how many spaces are in the lot to determine how many accessible spaces are required. The federal standard requires an accessible parking space to have a marked access aisle and a sign mounted at 60 inches to the bottom of the sign in front of the head of the space. So how am I going to do that in a gravel lot? How am I going to mark the access aisle? I've seen it done a lot of different ways. Sometimes a wheel stop that's painted blue for a certain distance. Sometimes it's 2 signs with arrows pointing to the middle. But just understand that if you have a designated parking area, not something where somebody's just bumming, a place to park along the side of the road. But if you've got a parking area, you need to determine how many spaces are in that parking area and provide accessible parking. Remember, the first space is always going to be a van space. That's 16 feet minimum. 8-foot parking, 8-foot access aisle. The requirement for trail signs is really removed. There was a lot of pushback from having to provide any additional or any signs in trailheads. And so the requirement is where a new trailhead information sign is provided at a trailhead on a newly constructed or altered trail. So it's when you decide to put up a trailhead sign. Once you decide to put up a trailhead sign, here's the catch. It requires you to provide a bunch of information, okay? It's going to ask you for the length of the trail or trail segment, the surface type, the tread width, typical and minimum, and the running and cross slope, typical and maximum. So if you're putting up a trailhead sign about a new or altered trail, you not only need to just put its name there, but now you have these different elements that are also required on that sign to have visual information. Remember, there's never a requirement for Braille or tactile signs unless it's at a door, right? That's the only time you have to have Braille or tactile signage is at a door, because a person that's blind is not going to find the tactile information out here in the woods, right? right? They're only going to find it if it's adjacent to a door to determine what's inside that door. So never tactile or braille, but it does require font size, and you want to think about how far people are away from it. I can't tell you how many times I see these trailhead signs, and they're about 6 feet off of any prepared surface in the grass over there where it's eroded in the mud. Um, and they have stuff on the backside too that you got to sneak around somehow and get over there, right? Think about if you're handing things out, the reach range. Nothing can be higher than 48 inches. If there's pamphlets or things that you want people to grab, it has to be 48 inches to 15 inches above the finished surface, somewhere in that range. Okay, it cannot be above 48. Um, think about preparing the surface all the way to it. The National Park Service has some really good wayside information about how to create accessible waysides. And if you go to the Harpers Ferry National Park Service website, there's a wayside exhibit, a design guide. So if you're creating wayside exhibits or trail information like this, how to make sure they're accessible. Here are some of the technical requirements for that trail. It's a 36-inch minimum width. If it's only 36 inches, the idea here is two people can't pass. So every 1,000 feet, there has to be at least 60 inches wide, okay, in 60 inches in length. So it requires this passing space. But imagine, look at the trail I'm showing you here that I took. This was in Arkansas. Imagine having to back up 1,000 feet on that, and you're in a manual wheelchair, or you're in something where you can't turn around. You're only 36 inches wide. So think about increasing the width wherever possible. But that minimum width is 36 inches if it's going to be accessible. Tread obstacles are permitted to be at 2 inches vertical. There is nowhere in any accessibility standard that permits that great of a change in level. And it could be this, tree roots across the whole surface. It could be non-stop tree roots like I'm showing you. 2-inch vertical change in level is permitted, and there's no scoping requirement about how frequently or how wide they could be. Can be really challenging depending on the type of mobility device you're using. I've been very fortunate to do a lot of what they call adaptive mountain biking, using one here in the county that I live in. One of the devices I use is called a Lasher, Lasher, and it's a three-wheeled adaptive bike that is also power assisted, and it can get over stuff like this. But for the most part, pedestrian trail, the type of trail devices that people have options to use, you're not going to get over a surface on a slope like this with these kinds of change in level. Openings is a 1/2 inch maximum if you had some kind of a grading system. This device on the right is called an instrumented surface indenter. And I'm currently chairing a committee in RESNA, the Rehabilitation Engineering Science of North America, to try to get a test method available for this device to be used to determine on natural surface trails in play areas if the surface is firm and stable. The standard does require a pedestrian trail to be firm and stable. How are you going to create that? How do you evaluate that? Currently, there's not a way to do that. I've been working for almost 20 years to get this device as part of a test method. No values put to it, but a test method to determine firmness and stability over time so that people that are managing properties with loose fill products or natural surfaces have an understanding of whether it really is firm and stable. So I'm showing you several pictures here at Indiana University and the National Center on Accessibility. When I was at the Access Board, we did a research study. It's there on the left, and that study is still available at the web link that I've provided here. And we did 9 different surface types, went for 7 years. We also did Governor Dodge Park. We did a bonded engineered wood fiber. That one, the lake flooded and it went up underneath it and it rotted out. But this bonded engineered wood fiber is really good to use in camping areas or areas where you might have an accessible route requirement, and you're looking for a natural surface. So it's a urethane bonded engineered wood fiber. Again, both of those research reports are available from that web link. The natural surface trail study, the one on the left, the unique thing about that too is we did a survey monkey and asked federal sites all around the country or any sites around the country to tell us what they're using to make a firm and stable surface on natural surfaces. And so there's a lot of good information geographically for the southeast, northeast, northwest, some in the central part of the country, on what they were using. I think what the study really came out to say was if you're going to use a crushed aggregate, whatever you can get locally, limestone, granite, whatever it is you can get locally, do a 3/4 inch minus stone. Okay. Do a 3/4 inch minus so that it knits together well. And then even adding stone dust and water and compacting, just compacting, vibrotamping, rolling, whatever, is honestly about the strongest, best accessible surface that we found. Okay. Just using natural products that you can get locally, 3/4 inch minus all the way down to stone dust, wet it, compact it, and you create a very solid surface. When you create an accessible trail and all the stone is the same size, whether it's pea gravel or bigger, it makes it very challenging. They don't knit together well. That's why you almost have to use that 3/4 inch minus so that it all knits and compacts very well. When we talk about running slope of a trail, these are some of the most extreme slopes you see in any accessibility standards. You can see that you go, based on how steep you go, you have to provide a resting interval more frequently. So you can go at an 8% grade, 5% to 8% grade for 200 feet before you have to provide a resting area. And a resting area is at least 5 feet long, the width of the trail. And that's whether you're going to have a heart attack, sit with your honey for a second, just get a drink of water or go on. The steeper it gets, the more frequently these resting areas are expected. You can see that an 8% grade to a 10 is every 30 feet, and a 10% grade all the way up to 1 and 8 is every 10 feet you would need to level off. So very different than shared use paths. The idea here is, you won't want bicycles going off these series of jumps, but when you're talking pedestrians and pedestrians using mobility devices, that flattened off area is really essential in order to give somebody an opportunity to rest and catch their wind or whatever and go again. So cross slope is based on the type of material you're using. It's 5% cross slope unless you're using concrete, asphalt, or boards. The expectation is 2% or 1 in 48. Resting intervals, I told you, is 60 inches long alongside the trail. You can do it adjacent to the trail or you can do it on the trail. Again, there's a cross slope requirement based on the type of material that you're using. If ever you're using gates or barriers to restrict access, it requires a minimum of 36 inches, no narrower. 36 inches is the minimum width. It also requires, if there's gate hardware, that it be accessible. When I say accessible, it means no higher than 48 inches and you can do it with a closed fist. Okay? That's the expectation. Don't make somebody that's in a mobility device go around some big boulders and off into the dirt on a slant or on a cross slope and get back up on, because you're trying to keep ATVs and whatever else off there. Remember, 36 inches minimum width on any pedestrian trail where there's gate or bollard, and you're trying to restrict access. You need a minimum of 36 inches. Protruding objects, you cannot create an obstruction below 80 inches that overhangs your trail. But natural things can. If your trail goes under a tree, that's fine that it's not an 80-inch vertical height. If it goes under a rock, through a cave, whatever, it's still permitted. It's where you construct something cannot overhang the trail so that somebody runs into it with a visual impairment or somebody that's, blind. Trail facilities. If you're creating facilities along a trail, like a camping area or a picnic area, those areas are also required to be accessible, but you can use the trail requirements instead of an accessible route requirement to connect elements and spaces on that little site. Okay, so if you got there only on a trail, you can use the trail requirements to connect those elements and spaces now, and not a accessible route. So on the federal land, even if the trail does not meet accessibility requirements, those outdoor constructed features or cabins or whatever you're putting out there still have to be accessible. So there's a requirement, even if the trail's not accessible, that whatever you constructed out there still meets the minimum requirements. So how do I know I'm altering an existing trail? If you're changing, okay, when the original design the original function or purpose of an existing trail has changed, regardless of the reason. I don't care if you had a washout, a timber knockdown, whatever it was. If you reroute that trail, you have now altered it. Okay, and now you need to determine, is it directly connected to the trailhead or to another trail that substantially meets these requirements to determine whether or not that alteration needs to comply. No matter what, though, you're going to do the best you can. That's the whole idea, right? Even if you can't meet these, you're still going to do the best you can and then document what you can and can't do. This is a technical assistance guide that I wrote when I was at the Access Board. This was actually a dirt trail. It's in Georgia, and it was covered by pine needles. And that made it very accessible because even when they'd had a rain or stuff, that pine needles really worked well to create that firm and stable surface over time. This is a technical assistance document that brings you all the minimum requirements for trails or picnic or camping or beach access or viewing areas all in one place. I think, I shared with you early on that chapter 2 scoping, chapter 10's technical, and then there's a lot of things in between those two chapters that you still have to understand, right? The great thing about a technical assistance guide is it brings you all the requirements in one location for the facility type you're creating, okay? So that you don't think you're missing anything. It brings up everything you need to consider about that specific, okay? So here's the link for you to find that. Available free, you can print them. You can just use it as a resource online. You can sell them if you can. They're in the public domain, so if you can get a dime for it, have at it. It's free to do that. That's all I was going to say about pedestrian trails. Renee, do we have any questions yet about pedestrian trails?
We do not have any questions. And I just remind everyone, if you do have one, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll stop Bill along the way to ask that question. So while you're thinking of something, put it right in the chat.
Yeah, so again, I would just remind you of some of that design intent and some of the ideas here that we're not connecting elements or spaces on a site. Okay, this is a recreational path just for that. Okay, it's just a recreational opportunity. Not connecting elements and spaces on a site. And that gets really challenging, right? In an urban park, that's what you're typically doing, right? You're using and I think a lot of times in urban parks, it's a shared use path because you do allow bikes. You're going to have kids with small bike or stroller, whatever, right? And you're going to be circling around and then you start connecting elements, right? You connect to a fishing pier or you connect to a boat dock or you connect to a sports field or a playground. Well, that portion that connects to any one of those elements is not a shared use path or a pedestrian trail. It is only an accessible route because at least one accessible route is required to connect all elements and spaces on the same site required to be accessible. Okay, so think about what you're using your routes to do, but that's what this forum was really about: is what type of route facility, right, are we creating, and understanding what should we be using in order to make sure that we're doing the best we can to facilitate the widest user group, young to old, able, disabled, to have the opportunity to participate. So moving into the shared use path requirements. Remember, I told you that they're part of a public rights of way rulemaking that came out from the Access Board last fall. This was a rulemaking that took almost 20 years to finalize. Cities and local governments have been using the sidewalk and pedestrian signal requirements, the detectable warning requirements now for more than a decade because this rule took so long to get out. And the reason it took so long to get out is because every rule has to go through an economic assessment. And the economic assessment was huge with this type of a rule, determining what the cost impact was. And the other thing was, the longer this rule was out there before it became final, more and more people were already using it because it was a best practice. Remember, I told you earlier on that not only your programs and your services, but your facilities have to be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. And in order to find that safe harbor, what do? I suggest that you now say that any shared use paths that are being designed or constructed are going to follow these minimum guidelines until they're the enforceable standard and adopted by the Department of Justice. That this is the best way to say that we are being inclusive and incorporating the widest user group we possibly can, and keeping ourselves out of financial and litigation issues over time by constructing these correctly. These facilities last for decades, okay? These typically last for decades. Once you create a pedestrian trail or a shared use path, they're not going away, okay? This is something that you're going to improve over time and maintain over time. And that's another big issue, that accessible features have to be maintained. They have to be maintained over time. If the grab bar falls off the bathroom wall, guess what? You got to go put it back on. If your surface is not accessible, guess what? You've got to maintain it to. Well, I was on the slide here, and what I was saying is that it can be really challenging where you have a climate where your pedestrian trails might not be open all year, right? They may change to something else. Maybe they go to a snowmobile, or they go to a cross-country skiing trail, or they go to something else. And so I think that what is so important there is to think about that cross-country skiing can still be done from an adaptive device, right? And that as often as possible, you should consider the different types of programs or opportunities on your pedestrian trails, and how do we make sure we're facilitating that wide user group of having access to it. So it may not be open anymore as a pedestrian trail. Now it might be a snowmobile trail, or it might be something else during the middle of the winter, like I said, like a cross-country skiing. And so making sure that when it is open as a pedestrian trail, it meets those minimum requirements is what we're talking about today. It's the
Bill,
same with the, yes?
when you've got a sec here, we've got a
Okay,
message here, and it relates to this, so I just want to make
okay,
sure we get it in. The
okay.
question is, if a trail was developed before 2010, would the maintenance have to comply to the 2010 standards or the 1991 ADA standards?
Well, well, I don't think there'd be much of a difference for the surface material and not for the slope or cross slope. And so there's really wasn't any changes in the difference of surface technical requirements between those two versions. And so I would think that, well, the only way that you don't have to meet the 2010 standards in an alteration is if you met the requirements in the 1990 version, 91 version. Okay. So to give an example, the reach range went from 54-inch high side reach to 48-inch high side reach. So in 1991, you could have a light switch, a thermostat, whatever, in an accessible room as high as 54 inches. It went to 48 inches in the 2010 standard. The standard gave an exception that said if you met the 1991, you don't have to meet the 2010 until it's altered. But once you alter, you would have to bring it down to 48. So I would say that even though you met the 1991, once altered, you would have to make sure you comply with the 2010 for an accessible route. But remember, there's not pedestrian trail requirements in the 2010 ADA standards, and there wasn't in the 1991. So there wasn't any safe harbor back then to say I met the earlier standard. I would think you'd want to evaluate it if this is a pedestrian trail. I would say the most important thing to do is get out there and evaluate the length of that trail, right? Understand what you have. I think that's the most important thing about existing facilities. There are so many ways now to evaluate existing facilities. And so evaluate your existing facility, understand where you are in compliance and where you're not, and then let people understand that. Okay, where am I in compliance? And then hopefully over time, those alterations connect the dots, right? They make a longer accessible trail. You might have miles of trail, but only 1 mile that's accessible. And hopefully that's connected to the trailhead. It's right off the bat. But it's so important to just let people understand what you have available. And in order to do that, you really have to evaluate your existing facility that you currently have now. I can't overemphasize how important it is to understand what you have in your inventory now. Got another one, Renee? No?
We do
Okay,
not.
let's
Nope.
move on to shared use paths then. Um, We talked about that it's a multi-use path designed primarily for bicycles, pedestrians, and other authorized motorized or non-motorized, right? And it can be used as a transportation purpose, but it also could be recreational. Shared use paths physically separated from motor vehicle traffic. Sometimes here in an urban area, it's only pylons, but that it's in an open space or a barrier, and they're either within a highway right of way or other public right of way. So there is no minimum width in the requirement. Okay, that's typically the jurisdiction. So a lot of times they're built with to the AASHTO Green Book. I don't know if you've dealt with the AASHTO Green Book before, but a lot of times they're talking about at least a minimum 8-foot width, and they're talking about a grass border on either side. But the minimum width is not defined by these guidelines. Just that the full width of whatever you create has to comply. Okay, so the full width of whatever you create has to comply, but it's up to your jurisdiction or your local to determine how wide you're making your shared use pass. Where shared use pass crosses a median or a pedestrian refuge island, a clear width of a pedestrian access route must be at least 60 inches minimum and at least as wide as the crosswalk, whichever is greater. Okay, so obstructions such as bollards or things like that, we talked about 36 inches on a pedestrian trail. When we're talking shared use path, you cannot have a bollard. You typically don't want bollards where people are riding bikes. Okay, you typically don't want to be doing that. People are going to come up on them fast and not see them, or they're just an obstruction. But if you're putting up bollards, 48 inches measured to the edge of the obstruction. Okay, you have to have at least 48 inches. It does require firm, stable, and slip resistant, whereas pedestrian trails don't require slip resistance. The grade cannot exceed the grade established by an adjacent roadway or highway if they're within that highway right of way. Okay, so if you're adjacent to a road, you get the road slope, whatever it is. You can run the same thing. Cross slope, still 2.1, 148. If you're outside of a public right of way, you're just running back through the woods, 5% maximum running grade. 5%, that's not very much. Okay. In most areas of the country, 5% is going to make you weave back and forth a lot to get through areas. If you're over 5%, it does require handrails. It does on a shared use path. I thought that was horrible that they came out with that, but that is where it came out. Over 5%, you're looking at handrails. Cross slope is still at 2.1%. You cannot construct something that overhangs it. Okay, similar to a pedestrian trail. You do not want to create something that swipes somebody off a bike, has a sign too close to the edge, anything that you're constructing. Okay, so objects with leading edges more than 27 inches above the finished floor or ground surface and less than 80 cannot protrude horizontally more than 4 inches into that clear width that you've provided. Okay, the whole circulation path, not more than 4 inches. You must create a minimum 80-inch vertical clearance on a shared use path. You cannot have a change in level greater than a ½ inch. Okay, this can be real challenging, right? Where you're going to a concrete sidewalk all of a sudden from asphalt. Maybe it settles. ½ inch is the biggest change in level permitted along a shared use path. Again, no greater opening than a ½ inch. If they're elongated, they're supposed to be perpendicular to the direction of travel. But again, you only get a ½ inch on a grade. If you're crossing a flangeway gap, you're crossing a railway, you can see that based on the type of track it is, if it's light rail in an urban setting, you get 2.5 inches. Okay, that's the biggest opening. If you're going across freight, they give you 3 inches. Okay, you want that as perpendicular as possible to the direction of travel. You do not want to run and make that to where somebody's front wheels, casters, or anything get into it. As close to perpendicular as possible. Curb ramp must extend the full width. So if you're running a 8-foot width and you come to a road, the curb ramp needs to be as wide as the shared use path coming to it. Okay, so you can't narrow down at a street. You have to keep it just as wide. 8.33 or 8% grade is the maximum running grade of a curb ramp, and it does require one curb ramp per crossing. It cannot send you as a diagonal curb ramp to the middle of the road. Okay, it has to be one per crossing. So here you're seeing it go in two directions. You'd have a curb ramp going in each direction, not one down the middle aimed towards the middle of the road. It does require that detectable warning surface, at least 24 inches minimum back from the curb. That's the width of it, but it must run the full width of your curb ramp. It does require it to go back, it says between 6 and 15 feet from where that obstruction or where you're going to cross a road. So 6 to 18 or 6 to 15 feet is where you'd have your detectable warning. The full width for a minimum width of 24 inches. Similar to what we talked about in the pedestrian trail requirements, there's also requirements that exempt you when you're doing a shared use pass, similar to what we called conditional exceptions. Remember in pedestrian trails, we called them conditional exceptions. And they do the same thing with shared use pass. And the idea here is you do the best you can, right? If you can't meet a technical requirement, that 36 inches wide on a shared use path, we're talking the full width. If you can't meet the running slope, you need to document. You need to document why you can't do that in the project file. So the physical constraints under shared use pass, it says where compliance with the grade requirements is not feasible due to existing terrain or infrastructure, the available right-of-way, notable natural feature or similar existing physical site constraint, you do the best you can. Okay, and that's so important to document so that everybody understands if there ever was litigation about that it's not accessible here because the slope's too great or something, that there's this opportunity to show why that occurred and that you did the best you can. So again, where compliance with grade requirements is precluded by federal, state, or local laws, the purpose to which is to preserve an endangered or threatened species, the environment, you have some kind of cultural or historic or significant natural feature. Again, you do the best you can. I threw these in here because I think we talked a little bit about this in the play area forum that we did, but that remember when you decide to put up site furnishings, and I honestly believe benches along walking trails is an important feature. I really do. I believe people need an opportunity to sit down and rest. They might have gone farther than they think they can. They need an opportunity to just take a break, and they might not have brought a walker that they can sit down on. So I'm thinking about people that are ambulatory, not somebody that's using a mobility device, because if someone's using a mobility device, they are not transferring to your bench. Okay, they're not transferring to your bench. They're going to stay in their, seating system that was designed for them in their mobility device or their scooter's padded seat or whatever, typically. So the idea of a bench, there's not a requirement for the bench itself to be 18 inches off the ground or provide handrails or a back or anything like that. But remember, all of those features really help somebody. I mean, my mom is 90. I just got back from visiting her, and we took a short walk on a trail and was very fortunate. She had her walker to where she could turn and sit down on because we had gone just a little too far. And then we needed to make our way back. So I think benches do serve a real important function along trails as well as a social gathering area. This one in this picture, I'm showing you that it takes up part of the shared use path. I would have actually moved this off of there and then created a space adjacent to the bench at the end of the bench for someone with a mobility device to also get off the surface of that path and be out of the way. And typically, sometimes it's fun to sit with everybody going across in front of you, but a lot of times it's nice to sit with them to your back, right? So think about how you face your benches and what you're really trying to show and how it's really supporting the user groups. The requirement is that a clear space be located next to either end of the bench, or if the bench has no end, such as in a round circular bench, and we don't find a lot of those, that you create a space somewhere near that bench, no closer than 18 inches. Permanent or public toilets along a shared use path. We find these oftentimes, especially on really long ones, must comply with the accessibility requirements. Remember, it's every single permanent type of toilet room or bathing room would have to be accessible. Now, this unit that you see here typically has a men's and a women's. If both of those were unisex or family, you would only have to make one of them accessible. And by doing so, okay, because there's a clustering requirement that says if they serve the same population and located in the same area, only 50% of your toilet rooms, not bathing, toilet rooms have to be accessible. This might allow you to make sure that the family restroom is large enough to maybe create or have a adult changing table, baby changing table, whatever you need in there. So you may be able to make one larger, being fully accessible, and the other one not quite as large. So it might reduce the size of your structure, maybe even permit you to do three. But think about that if you're doing men's and women's, it's going to be both are required to be accessible. But if they're both family or unisex, it would only be one of the two in a structure like this. Portable, it's 5%, no less than one of each type in each area. Okay, and my slide's not showing an accessible one, but what you want to do is at least make one accessible, because let me tell you, as needing the accessible one, it's the one that's always used, the bigger one. Make sure it complies. Make sure it's an accessible route to it. You can see that there's a change in level to get into these. The accessible one, there should be no change in level greater than a ½ inch. Okay, it's going to require a turning circle inside of it. It also requires the international symbol of accessibility to be on the door, okay, of an accessible one. I say if it costs the same, you get them all the accessible ones, okay? If you only have one, it's an accessible one, okay, which means it's wheelchair accessible. It's on an accessible route, pretty much got a hard surface to it. Don't put it up on a curb, okay? You'll never get in it. Make sure it's down on the hard surface. If you're going to do signs along your shared use path, okay, there's no requirement for them to be tactile, no requirement for Braille, but there are visual requirements about the finish and contrast, about the size and style, and that the height is no less than 40 inches minimum from the ground. Okay, no less than 40. Now, I got a QR code for you here, and this gives you a whole bunch of playlists that are on YouTube right now that the Access Board created about this rulemaking, the public rights of way rulemaking. And you can learn a lot more about shared use paths by going through this resource right here. And I provided that on the handout. I'm hoping that could also be scanned through the handout. I wanted to highlight just a couple other resources for you, and that is that there's an ADA national network that holds a national ADA symposium, but also regional conferences. And that, as you can see here, Minnesota's in region number 5. And region number 5 is out of Chicago, Illinois. And Robin Jones is the executive director, a wonderful lady. And they can be an invaluable resource for you on answering questions. They have recreation facility checklists, okay, that you can reach out to. And I put that link there that you could, if you have a group of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, community groups that's willing to go into your recreation facilities and determine. There is not a checklist for pedestrian trails or shared use paths, but there are for play areas and sports fields and fishing piers and recreational boating facilities and golf and miniature golf, things like that. And those checklists could be used on existing facilities to determine compliance. That 800 number, 949-4232, would get you to the Chicago office. And you can use them as resources for all kinds of things. But they are there, funded nationally, to provide assistance in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. I formerly worked at the U.S. Access Board, and I'm pretty biased about the information that they create and the work that they do, whether it's their animation, their technical assistance guides, their monthly webinar series, that there is no better resource than to go to the people that wrote it and that enforce it federally, but also write the technical assistance materials. And so here is their information where you can reach them by phone. You see their hours. They also, you can go directly to that shared use path in its rights of way at access-board.gov, or you can send an email to TA@access-board.gov and you'll get your response in writing. Okay. So if you've got a project you're working on and you've got a question about an accessibility feature, you can send it straight to them. They'll respond in writing. Very few federal agencies still give you an opportunity to get something in writing like that. And then at this time, I just wanted to leave you with their website, again, their information, and take on any questions you might have. If not, I can keep talking. Because I'll just say, well, Renee, while you're looking, let me just say that I did not address what we call other wheeled powered mobility devices. Okay. But the Department of Justice at ada.gov, if you put in that other wheeled powered mobility devices, they have a technical assistance guide for state and local governments. And the reason I bring this up is because you're going to have people, if you manage a shared use path or a trail, sooner or later, you're going to get somebody on a gator or somebody on something that you're going to say, wow, you're not supposed to be using that here. And they'll say, I'm a person with a disability, and the ADA says I can use this. Well, the ADA doesn't say you can use that, okay? The idea behind the other wheel power mobility devices technical assistance guide is that you need to develop a policy. You need to understand maybe a person with a disability can use a gator on a Wednesday morning, non-holiday week, sometime, down the road. But that give people an opportunity to understand what is permitted on your facilities. Okay. Can you use electric devices? Typically on all federal lands, anything designated as a device that can be used inside and outside is a wheelchair. And a wheelchair can go anywhere a pedestrian can go. Okay? So I'm talking electric scooter, I'm talking maybe even a Segway, I'm talking manual or motorized wheelchairs. If it's allowed indoors, it is considered as a pedestrian device on federal land. Um, there are a lot of devices out there now, though, like the track chairs, um, this lasher they're just not appropriate for indoor use, right? And so understanding when you can use those types of devices on your systems is so important to establish for your frontline staff, but also as a directive for those user groups to understand when I can use what and how to apply if I wanted to use something different and who can I talk to? Okay.
Well, there's not a question, but there's a nice compliment for you that it's been very informative and helpful, and you're an excellent person to relay this subject matter and explain it clearly.
Well, thank you. I didn't share with you early on, but I am a person that uses a manual wheelchair. I have for over 40 years as a result of a motor vehicle accident where I broke my back. And I'm an avid outdoors person. I love to fish. I love to hunt. I love doing trails. And as you heard, I love adaptive mountain biking. I've gone farther into the woods on an adaptive mountain bike now than I've ever gone since being paralyzed. And so access to the outdoors means a lot to me. I think it should mean a lot to everyone, right? The opportunity to get out and enjoy nature, but also just the freedom to move through these public spaces that are created for everybody to participate is so important. And I honestly believe people with disabilities need that outdoor experience just as much, if not more, than everyone else because of the limited activity you get. You think of pedestrian trails or shared use paths and you think of sidewalks and you think of that's the limited space you get. Okay. You're not off walking through the trees. You're not able to walk down the stream or creek or just beat off the path where you want to walk. Typically, you only get that prepared surface, and leaving that prepared surface, you typically don't do. And so to have these accessible features, these facilities through the environments that we all cherish is so important.
Well, it's not a question from the group, but I'm just wondering what's the most egregious issue you see in shared use paths and accessible routes that would be so easy to connect? As we were looking at the paths coming in and the approaches and having that the notification all across the path. Most of the time I see that as a much smaller in
The
dimension.
truncated domes,
Yes,
the
yeah,
detectable warning. Yeah,
yeah. So is there something that we should always be I know that you probably see it more so than us because A, you're an expert in the subject matter, but also you are in a chair. So what's something egregious that we should be thinking about? I mean, it's not just natural for everyone to think about the things that you do. So that's also helpful to think about
Yeah.
something simple.
Well, I always think site arrival. Imagine yourself arriving at this site. How do I get where? And is there that connection? Can I get through the gravel parking lot? Do I have to go across the grass to get over to read that sign? Have you planned for somebody in a mobility device to really have an opportunity to participate? Is the parking identified in accessible space so that nobody parks next to you and you can still drop your ramp or your lift out your vehicle? Um, is there that opportunity? Or are you trying to take up multiple spaces because you have to protect that side of your vehicle, that side? I think the other thing is that trail gates and barriers. There is such an effort to limit the use of ATVs and other motorized devices on so many of these trails that they feel the only way to restrict it is through some barriers that limit persons that, well, I can't get through anything smaller than 28 and a half inches, even turning sideways. So the idea that a trailgate or barrier, you get all the way there is not it. And then I think the other thing too is making sure that website information and the information that you convey to the public really addresses that running slope and surface material and how long do you get to go and things like that. It's like reading the side of the cereal box. Over time, you start to learn what it is. And you go out on a running slope that's too steep. Guess what? Next time you read it's that, you're not going back, right? So or you understand that if it's only a 5% grade, hey, I can do that. I can go all the way around here, or whatever you're doing. So I think providing information on an accessible website is key as well, and a huge barrier for a lot of people because everybody plans, right? Everybody's got their idea of planning, and a lot of times people with disabilities will go scout it out first just to see if it's even going to be possible. Street view gives you great opportunities urbanly now. I mean, you can kind of see if the building you got to stare out front or not. Um, but on a trail, just having the information about it, linking up with some of the national trail databases that support accessibility and put yours on there if it really meets it, is another huge thing to do.
Thanks, Bill. If I can inject with my own question, look, during the shared use path portion of your presentation, you talked about railings when you go something steeper than 5%. And that's something we don't see many trails that are beyond 5%, but when they do happen, we don't often see railings in it. So can you clarify, is there a certain distance, if you've only got 10 feet where you have to go to 6 or 7%, or what is the purpose and what is, sort of some better, more detailed guidelines as to what to look for there?
I I wouldn't put a short section up. I mean, unless it's really steep. But remember, when you're dealing with bicycles, you don't all of a sudden want to go steep for a short distance, because it creates a jump basically. So it's not a part of the rule I'm very proud of, to think that over 5% on an area where people are riding bikes at high speed, you'd have a handrail. I think it defeats the whole idea of having that grass runoff, right? Um, that area around that keeps the trees away that you're going to feel safe on. But the standard, what it does is here's what it does. It says you meet chapter 4 unless modified by this new supplement, the shared use path. And it doesn't exempt shared use paths from the accessible route requirement of over 5% having handrails and edge protection.
Okay.
So I I would do everything I can. If I had an existing one, I wouldn't worry about it. Okay, right now I would understand where my slopes are. I'd evaluate all my slopes, my widths, my surface materials. I would make sure that I understood where I am compliant and where's out of compliance. And if it ever came down to it, could I alter it to a point where I could take that slope out somehow, if it's not too long? Or could I regrade, or could I reroute some over time? On an existing facility, I wouldn't worry about running out there constructing handrails on an existing shared use path at this time. I would really focus on making sure all new construction is fully compliant, that I've done the best to minimize that slope. And then I would identify them as barriers on my existing, that there is no handrails and I've exceeded 5%. I would identify those. And so that people working on that facility over time understands that this is a corrective action that maybe should be part of a transition plan over time.
Okay.
I wouldn't do short sections. I don't think I would.
Sure.
I would, if I was going to do it, I would do it for a distance, and then I'd really work to somehow provide some kind of a barrier to where somebody can't run into the end of it too well. You know, I don't know, turning it out, I don't know, whatever to do, but so that nobody can run into something.
Great, thank you. Another question we run into fairly often talking about benches along trails or shared use paths is the question of whether to have some sort of railing or, end on that bench for people who need help getting up. You hear in some cases that's helpful. You hear in other cases they'd rather be able to slide off than to have something there as a barrier to them, or maybe it needs to be in a different place. What's your experience and what's generally actually workable?
I would think a mixture, right? I would think, I don't know too many people that want to sit on a bench for very long that doesn't have a back.
Right.
But the armrest sometimes can maybe be an obstruction if somebody was going to transfer, sit down. I think they help more people that have difficult standing as some form of transfer support to get back up. So I like the opportunity of handrails, but maybe you mix it up. Maybe you have some with and some without. You know, maybe you just, well, I just think that's probably the best resource, is just to provide a variety. And I think the most important part is get it off the route. Okay, so nobody's going to drive into the side of it or hit it hard, especially on a shared use path. Get it off the route, get it deep enough. My suggestion would be get it back so that they have 18 inches in front of the bench that is not part of the route. And then adjacent to that, one end or the other, you have a clear space that's 36 by 48 deep minimum off the route of the trail. For pedestrian trails, the bench requirement is that a clear space be at the end of a bench. Again, if there's only one in the area, that one, but a percentage of them over time in that area. And so the idea here, again, no back, no armrest is required, no height of the bench, no length of the bench, but that you not obstruct the route to the bench with a clear floor space or the bench.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Bill.
You
I
want
don't
me to
see
wrap
any
it
more
up?
questions. I think you've covered everything really
Okay.
well.
Well, let me just wrap it up then. And then they can always reach out to either of you two if they have a question that can get to me. And we can go from there. But I just want to thank both Renee and Joe for inviting me to have this opportunity at the forum, and that Minnesota means a lot to me. I was born in Minnesota, and I get back regularly. And I think it's really important to use the money wisely to create inclusive facilities that support users of all ages and all abilities all the time. And by at least incorporating these minimum requirements into the new construction and alteration of these two unique types of facilities, pedestrian trails and shared use paths, you can open the world to a lot of people that may have not had this opportunity in the past, but that look forward to it for the future. And so I thank you for considering this on every one of your projects going forward here.
Thank you, Bill. Before Renee closes up, I just want to note that I just dropped in the chat a evaluation. If you could please complete that and also give us any ideas of topics you would like on future forums so we can think about what the next topic might be. And when we get this video, and there will also be a copy of the slides, printable copy of the slides put onto our website. I will send a link to that to all of the registrants when we have that up on the website and available. So thank you, Renee.
That's it. Thanks everyone for attending today. Thank you, Bill, for being with us again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next quarter.
Sounds great. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks all.